correct. We could model that out.
Right.
But it's not just the lethality, it's this protean manifestations. Because what happened to us is that many people could say, well, I have lots of friends who just had a mild case, so I'm not going to pay attention.
So it seems, wrongly so, it seems less serious because you have these people who recover.
Yes, or who have a mild course. Exactly.
Who have a mild course. So really what we need is a virus that is quite demonstrable in its not just lethality. If people recover, it's like they went through some, like Ebola, where you see people bleeding from every single orifice and then they die. And then you're like, oh man, I don't want no parts of that.
Yes.
Okay, but then the virus is less likely to be transmitted if you're so effective at that stage. I mean, this is Nicholas's point, right? If the virus can fool 90% of the population into thinking it's nothing really serious, while it kills the others that it is, the virus is having its way.
Spreading, it's having its way. Oh my God.
Yes.
The virus is like that dude at the nightclub that tells every woman something different so that he can go home with a different woman every night.
Could be. I'm not sure I would make that.
Is that the exact analogy here, Chuck, we're going for? Okay. Wait, before we end the segment, Nicholas, could you just tell me what impact everybody being forced to stay home had on civilization?
Ooh.
Now, in my community of astrophysics, surely yourself as well, it's really not a thing. We didn't lose a beat having to work at home. Just with a good internet connection, I'm fine. But school children, other workplace challenges that have assembly lines, you can't do that from home. What was the net outcome of this?
Well, I mean, I like to think of pandemics as having three phases, respiratory pandemics. There's the immediate phase, and we are approaching the end of that right now. So we're not at the beginning of the end of the pandemic, but we are approaching the end of the beginning. The immediate phase goes up until 2022.
Said Winston Churchill, by the way.
Yes, but a different thing.
Quote.
Yeah.
About a different thing.
About a different thing, exactly.
I got to flesh that out. So it was after D-Day, and it looked like the Allies were encroaching on the Axis forces, and a reporter asked Winston Churchill, is this the beginning of the end? And he says, no, but it is the end of the beginning.
Yes,
so it was said of D-Day.
Exactly.
If I remember correctly.
Yeah, so I was exactly that language I was aping, Neil. But what you need to understand is that right now we are being hit with this biological and epidemiological wave of the virus that's spreading through this immunologically naive human population. And the virus is going to spread and spread and spread and spread among us in our country, and frankly, it has to in the whole world, until we reach this important threshold known as herd immunity. Basically, unless you're a hermit on the mountains or very lucky, everyone on the planet will either be infected with this virus or get vaccinated or both. So that's going to happen. We're going to cross that threshold soon in this country. And then we're finally going to put the epidemiological and biological impact of the virus behind us. This does not mean the virus is gone. The virus will still kill people. It's not eradicated, but at greatly reduced numbers. It'll fall into the background welter of things that kill us. But then we will enter the intermediate phase of the virus. It's like a tsunami has washed ashore and devastated the countryside. The waters finally recede, which is great, but now we have to clean up the mess. And it's that mess that you were alluding to. We're going to have to cope with the clinical, social, economic, and psychological aftershocks of all of this death and isolation and so on, all of this disruption. Millions of kids miss school. Millions of people will be grieving the loss of a loved one. Millions of people lost their jobs. Millions of businesses closed. We're borrowing trillions of dollars against the future to kind of cope with the present. We're going to have to pay those debts. And that's going to take a couple of years, I think, until 2024, where we're going to have this kind of stuttering emergence from the shock. And then I think beginning in 2024, it's going to be a little bit of a party, kind of like the roaring 20s of the 21st century, similar to the roaring 20s of the 20th century after the last major respiratory pandemic, the 1918 influenza pandemic of 100 years ago.
Well, there you go. Wow. Here's to a terrific 2024, people. Happy New
You
Year.
have flappers and everything, and
I think-
speakeasies and stuff.
Yes, I think it won't be exactly those things, but it's going to be people are going to be like a release, like any human population that survives a war or an earthquake or a hurricane or a plague. The survivors are going to be relieved, and I think they're going to have been cooped up. They're going to have been socially isolated. I think there's going to be a kind of a celebration, a kind of return, an exuberant overcorrection, a kind of return to normalcy.
Right.
And I think people will relentlessly seek out social interactions in nightclubs and restaurants and sporting events and political rallies going back. I think we're going to see a lot of political ferment, and people will be spending their money. You know, we've been saving our money during this pandemic, as people have for all past plagues. So yes, I think it's going to be quite a shift in our society, honestly.
Well, we got to take another break, but when we come back, I want to further probe the emergence from this portal, right? This portal that's on the horizon, and what the future society will look like. And will we carry this memory, or are we going to have to turn it into mythologies and legends to carry it for the next, for our great-grandchildren, so that they don't go through what we went through? Or does it the same all over again? When we come back on Star Talk. We're back, Star Talk. Third out of 3 segments. We're talking about the sociology of COVID, what it has done to us as a civilization. And we've got our guest from up at Yale, New Haven, Connecticut, Nicholas Christakis. And Nicholas, how do people find you in social media or elsewhere?
Oh, I'm on Twitter at NA Christakis, and then my lab is humannaturelab.net.
So Christakis, CHIRISTAKIS. Christakis,
NACHRISTAKIS, yes, on Twitter.
Christakis, okay. So, Nicholas, what of the fact that the coronavirus is so varied in its incarnations, that is there any hope it will ever end at all? You spoke of herd immunity. Isn't that for just one strain but not another? And if another strain, another mutation is different enough, doesn't that throw all of our immunizations out the window, and we got to sort of start this all over again?
Well, there are different sorts of ways that these types of plagues end. They have a biological end and a social end. The biological end, there are actually different types of biological ends. One biological end, we talked about this notion of herd immunity, when enough people, herd immunity is the idea that a group of people can be immune to a condition, even if not every constituent individual is immune. So, for example, if you vaccinate 96% of the population against measles, if one of the 4% unvaccinated people happens to get a case somehow, they don't create an outbreak because they're surrounded by immune people. And that percentage, that 96 percentage, is the herd immunity threshold, and it's actually given by a little mathematical formula that connects it to the intrinsic spreadability of the pathogen. So pathogens that spread more easily, you need higher numbers. Actually, the spreadability of a pathogen is quantified by something known as the basic reproduction number, the R sub 0, the R naught. And the formula for computing the herd immunity threshold is R naught minus 1 divided by R naught. So for the original strain of the virus, the R naught was 3. 3 minus 1 divided by 3 means that 67% of the population have had to have acquired immunity one way or the other, by vaccination, ideally, or naturally through infection, before we reach the herd immunity threshold. Now, I'm not going to go into
So measles is famously spreadable. That would have a correspondingly higher R naught.
Right.
Yeah, that's exactly right. So the R naught for measles is like, it's the most spreadable, it's like 16 or 18. So 18 minus 1 divided by 18 gets you a number that's like 96%.
But before you go any further, as the only non-scientist here, let me just tell those of you who are listening, what Dr. Christakis is saying is we are not at herd immunity. Okay.
Yes. Well, because the Delta variant, Chuck, has an R naught of 6. So 6 minus 1 divided by 6 gets you 83%. And the Omicron variant.
So give me all three. So the original one, whatever one that was, what was that immunity level?
Well, the R naught was about
2020.
Yeah, it was about 3. And so its herd immunity threshold was about 67%. Now, let me just quickly say, for some listeners who might know, it turns out this is a simple arithmetic calculation. If you take into account network structure and the fact that people vary in how many connections they have, it actually brings that number down a little. But that's not really relevant for our conversation right now. These other strains can be more spreadable and can have and are more spreadable.
Okay, how about Omicron?
Omicron, we don't know. They are not for sure yet.
Everybody's got Omicron now. Everybody's coming down with it.
Yeah, if you don't have it, you're not cool, man.
I
know. I do not want to encourage people to get infected.
I know. I shouldn't even joke like that. I should not even joke like that.
No, you can. That's because you're Chuck. I'm not. But seriously. So we don't know exactly what the intrinsic R naught of the pathogen is. The reason Omicron is so effective is it has a second property, which is its capacity for immune escape. In other words, it can reinfect people who were previously immunized, either by infection or by vaccination, which is a different property. Either way, however, we're getting lots of cases. But here's the thing. You asked me about how pandemics end. One way they end is that enough people get immunized, either through vaccination or through infection, that finally the germ runs out of places it can go. A second way may be what's happening with Omicron, and I actually discussed this in Apollo Zero, which is that there's this tendency, it's theorized and often seen, but it's hard to prove, a tendency of pathogens to become more benign with time. So another biological end, which is likely to be the case, is that this pathogen will mutate to become less deadly, which may be happening with Omicron. So in other words, if you think about it, as you mentioned earlier, Neil, if the virus infects me and sickens me quickly and kills me, that variant of the virus dies with me. Mm-hmm. Yeah. But if the virus gives me a mild illness and doesn't put me in bed and I'm out and about spreading it, those variants of the virus come to be ascendant. They are more fit from a Darwinian point of view. So they will spread more. And so what happens with the time is that the more spreadable, less deadly variants of the virus, on average, in general, it is theorized, tend to come to predominate. So that's the second way that we get to a biological end.
So if the mild version is ascendant, then does that mean ultimately it will think of it as the common cold?
Yes.
Or the flu.
Yes, and I think that's what's going to happen. And in fact, as I argue, I think that's probably what happened in 1890. There was a so-called Russian flu that many people think was influenza, but some other people speculate, myself included, it might have been the last great coronavirus pandemic. The 1890 Russian flu might actually have been coronavirus. And now the virus, it may be the case that a coronavirus that causes the common cold, something called OC43, may actually be the distant echo of that, what was then a very serious respiratory pandemic 100 years ago, more than 100 years ago. So that's the second kind of biological end. A third biological end is that over great stretches of time, thousands of years, of course, we evolve to deal with a virus. So, for example, many humans have adaptations against malaria, against tuberculosis, against other pathogens that have been around for a long time, because those of us that are vulnerable die and don't reproduce as effectively, and other humans with different mutations survive. Now, that's not going to be the case in our lifetimes. That's over long eons. But in addition to the biological ends that we've been discussing just now, there are also social ends. And the social end of the pandemic is when people say, you know what, we're just going to accept this. And I think that's beginning to happen in our society, where people are saying they are kind of
enough
beginning.
Is enough.
Yes, something like that. And that can define, you see, a social end of the pandemic. Even if the germ is still going about its business, at some point humans may declare victory or put their head in the sand, and however you want to see it. And that will mark the social end of the pandemic.
Oof. I got to tell you, none of those sound good.
I know, right? Is it too soon now to begin a social end of the pandemic?
I would say so. I mean, I know people are, one of the metaphors I use is, I don't have terrific teeth, unfortunately. When I was in Greece, as a boy, there was no fluoride in the water. So I've had many root canals. I don't know if you guys have, or maybe some of your listeners have had root canals, but they're awful.
I get my teeth are basically never had a problem.
See, but listen, The trade-off is the government doesn't control your brain now. There was no fluoride in the water.
Well, I wish there'd been
Chuck
fluoride when I was.
is all read up on this stuff.
Yes, exactly. All the conspiracy theories is a go-to guy. No, but the thing is, the thing about a root canal is that your being in the dentist chair and wishing the root canal to end has no bearing on whether you need a root canal. In other words, yes, you need the root canal, and you're not wanting it has absolutely nothing to do with it. And that's the same with the virus. Our desires about the virus are irrelevant to the virus. The virus is another feature of the natural world. It has its own destiny. There's debate about whether viruses are living or not. That's a topic for another conversation. But for the sake of argument, it's acting like any other living thing. It is having what is known in evolutionary biology as an ecological release. It's like when we accidentally release rats onto an isolated Pacific island and they overrun the place. This virus is overrunning us. It's just spreading and spreading and spreading in us. It's found untapped terrain, and it's just going to have its way with us. So our desires have nothing to do with what happens, unfortunately, to the virus. But we can develop a kind of social modus vivendi with the virus. We can just sort of say, well, we're just, we've had enough. Now, I think, Neil, it is too early for us to do that. I think if we behave better, we can still reduce the toll of mortality in our society. I think that the simplest thing we can do is to be vaccinated. We can get boosted for the existing boosters, but what is also going to be on the horizon is the pharmaceutical companies are going to release new boosters for new variants, which I would encourage listeners to get when they come out, just like you got your annual flu shot or you got your tetanus shot every 10 years. We're going to have these other booster shots, which it will make sense to get. And I think we need to recognize that this mRNA vaccine technology that we have is mind-boggling. It is going to change the future of how human beings, how our species responds to pandemic disease, because we now have a technology that will allow us to rapidly prototype and develop bespoke vaccines against novel pathogens, so that the period of time under which we must suffer either the social withdrawal or the death will be reduced. And I think that is a feature, one thing that has been different about this pandemic compared to all the ancestral ones, and will also be different with respect to future pandemics.
Science to the rescue!
Yes.
But of course, Nicholas, because the vaccines would develop so quickly, became a reason for people to distrust them.
I know.
They use that fact against the vaccine.
I know.
Rather than be delighted
yes.
in how quickly it arrived. So what you're a sociologist, explain that.
And also before you explain that, you might, because in your book you talk about the fact that the mixed messaging on masks was also a very bad thing.
Yes, I think that there's going to be a reckoning, and I think that many scientists, there are many different. Science is a human enterprise, of course, and people vary in their beliefs. They vary in their ability to collect facts. They vary in the facts that they've gathered themselves. Different experimenters come do different experiments. They vary in their analysis of the body of facts. They come to different conclusions. This is to be expected, and I think one of the things that's very important to explain to listeners is that when scientists disagree, that's a feature, not a bug of science, right? That's how science progresses. It's theology where there's no disagreement, ostensibly, right? Like scientists disagreeing with each other is how the process works. And we test our ideas against the truth. We test our ideas against the natural world. And that's part of the process. So the disagreement itself, we could have done a better job preparing the public to see that scientists might, for example, disagree about masking, but very quickly we're going to do experiments and we're going to come to some consensus. So that would have been helpful. Now, on the speed with which the vaccines were invented, it's true that they were invented quickly, but now the experiment's been done. Hundreds of millions of people have been vaccinated. The vaccines are incredibly safe. We have dozens and dozens of studies that show that they are also effective, not just in the original randomized trials, but now in large-scale epidemiological studies. And it's built on 200 years of science. I mean, why were we doing this for 200 years, developing these vaccines? Beginning with cowpox being used for smallpox. So no, it's not the case that that we're doing some kind of creepy experiment with a world population, releasing completely unknown technologies. That's not
and
what's
even
happening.
if we were, even if that were the case, which it is not, but even if it were, it worked. All right, just look at this. It worked, people.
Yes.
So look, my nephew won't get vaccinated for whatever reason. I keep trying to cajole him into doing it, but I said to him, "Bro, I'm your guinea pig. I did it for you. I'm fine."
Yes.
Chuck, you might also you have relatives that are anti-vaxxers?
I do. I have actually more than one. I have two nephews who are anti-vaxxers, and they're young. What I don't understand is they're young, and they don't want to have any part of it. They're also kind of conspiracy theorists as well. So, by the way, both you nephews know who you are. I know you listen to this podcast. I'm not using your name right now, but I could call you out, and I'm not calling you stupid, but I could. Any minute.
So, Nicholas, I want to try to end on a positive note. Is there any demographic shift in respect for science as you go to the younger generation?
I don't know the answer to that. I'm sure the answer is known. I'm sure there's polling.
Many of them are leading the climate change initiatives.
Yes.
So
I think it's an open question. I think if you force me to pick, I think that the demonstration of the power of science during this pandemic, for example, through the invention of the mRNA vaccine, for instance, which I think ultimately will become widely acknowledged, and the fact that there were many scientists who were correctly calling what was going to happen during this pandemic, may increase public confidence in science with respect to other global catastrophes. I taught a course at Yale last semester on global catastrophes with Bill Nordhaus, the famous economist who won the Nobel Prize for his work on climate change.
Stop name dropping.
Yeah, exactly. Well, I mean,
I come talk with a Nobel laureate at my Yale class. Okay.
All my friends have Nobel Peace Prizes.
Chuck, you got to get you one. Get you one, Chuck. Get you a Nobel laureate.
I was on a podcast with Neil deGrasse Tyson. How about that? No, but I mention it only because his people may not know who he is, but just to mention his credentials. Anyway, we taught a class on global catastrophes, and you can think of the coronavirus pandemic as a kind of accelerated version of the challenge we were going to face with climate change. Wow, we have to rely on each other. It affects the whole globe. There's a role of science. There's a disputation about what to do, about what's happening. All of these features. There's risk tolerance. Who should tolerate what risk and at which generation? All of these features that are features of the climate change debate and conversation, I think are features of how the world is working on coronavirus. And by the way, the international collaboration that will be required to detect and respond to future pandemics. Just by the way, we get respiratory pandemics every 10 or 20 years. There was, for example, one in 2009, the H1N1 influenza pandemic, but nobody remembers it because it just gave you the sniffles. We get serious respiratory pandemics every 50 or 100 years. We mentioned the 1918 pandemic. There was also a 1957 pandemic, which killed 110,000 Americans, which would be 220,000 Americans today. So this one we're having is the second worst one we've had in 100 years. We're going to have more pandemics in the future, and there's some scientific evidence that the interpandemic interval is shortening. So we could get another one in 5 years, in 10 years, in 20 years, in 30 years. We don't know when it's going to happen. But it's clear to me that we're going to need some kind of international system for monitoring the emergence of these new pathogens and responding as a global population to it. And that system also is going to be analogous to the kinds of systems we need to deal with climate change. So there are many ways in which the coronavirus pandemic is analogous to this other global catastrophe that's on the horizon. And
it's a shot across our bow. It's a shot across our bow.
And I think that young people may see the utility of science, may have seen it in their own lives with respect to the coronavirus pandemic, and therefore, Neil, come to also apply it, as you suggested, to other challenges. So I hope, inshallah, as they say, I hope that that we will have a more sober-minded, more pragmatic, and more respectful, I'm not going to say deferential, but respectful attitude towards the utility of science in our society, which, one more thing, is actually the root of our wealth and security. Like one of the things
Yes,
that's
of
hilarious
course.
to me is people use this device, which was invented by scientists and engineers. Actually, you can trace this device back to Faraday in 19th century, in England, and they use it to say, "Oh, these scientists don't know what they're talking about." I mean,
For those of you who are just listening, Dr. Christakis is holding up a smartphone.
yes.
A smartphone, of course. Yes. And we got to land this plane. But here's a quote that I saw on a poster during the Science March. First, one of the posters said, things are really bad when scientists have to march. So that was the first.
That's a great poster.
That was right. Another one was, what do we want? A time machine. When do we want it? It doesn't matter. That was my other second favorite. Third favorite was, every disaster movie begins with a person in power ignoring the warnings of a scientist.
Yeah.
Every single one of them.
Yes.
Well, Nicholas, this has been a delight. Thank you for giving of your time. And we need you to go back and teach your class with all your Nobel laureate friends.
Oh, stop it! I'm going to go back to my. I'm going to go back to my lab. I'm going to go back to my lab.
But thanks for coming on relatively short notice, because you only came to. I knew of you from previous years, but just to have you as relevant to anything I'm doing, that was only in the last few days. Thanks for your fast turnaround.
Thank you so much.
To make this happen.
Thank you both for having me. It's been a pleasure.
All right, Chuck. Always good to have you here, man.
Always a pleasure.
All right, next time you're going to call out your nephews. All right,
Please do. I'm telling you. You know why? They may actually do something if Neil deGrasse Tyson calls them out.
But seriously, your nephews, what they need to understand is that death is a problem of the aged in general. In other words, young people face a very low risk of death from all causes, but coronavirus increases your nephew's risk of death by about 30%. In other words, they're young people. They have a 1 in 1,000 or probably a 1 in 5,000 chance in dying in the next year. But coronavirus might increase that to 1.3 in 1,000. Now, they may think, oh, absolutely, that's trivial, but that's actually a really substantial increased risk of death, And anyway, this is the conversation I have with the young people in my extended family.
That's good.
Good luck.
Listen, they're listening right now. They listen, so they're here.
So you must be fun at the dinner table. This has been Star Talk, another COVID installment, catching up with what it's doing and where it's going, where it came from. I'm Neil deGrasse Tyson, your